This episode of the Creative Nonfiction Podcast is dedicated to Melissa Robinson. She's a Tier 3 Patreon member. Yes, that tier gets you like transcripts and coaching and other great things. And I just want to give a shout out to Melissa. Oh, and by the way, today, day this publishes, is December 31st. Oh my goodness. That means that it is the deadline for the audio magazine titled or themed Heroes. Email any submissions you might have. It's got to be done by today, by 11:59 p.m. PST. Email to creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com with Heroes in the subject line. It's a written thing. I judge them based on writing, and then we work on the audio later. So, if that tickles your fancy as the last thing you do in 2021, well, I hope you'll submit, all right? Dig it.
It's never comfortable prying and doing what is really an indecent thing, which is walking into someone's home, walking into a stranger's home who's just invited you in and saying, nice to meet you. I'd like you to tell me about some of the most painful memories in your life, and I'm going to record it.
Well, is it just me, or is it the 3 beers I've had? I don't know. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I speak to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. Do I have a drinking problem? I don't think so. I'm Brendan O'Mara. How's it going? Mike Damiano. My goodness. He's bringing 2021 to a close with his piece for the Atavist about an unlikely revolutionary who helped the people of Easter Island earn rights they deserved from an oppressive Chilean naval regime. It's the story of Alfonso Rapu, a school teacher turned revolutionary via nonviolence, an unlikely hero, and, as it were, somewhat of an anti-hero. You gotta love those shades of gray, man. Mike is a staff writer for Boston Magazine, and like many people writing stories for the Atavist, he'd been working on this Easter Island story for years. Atavist becomes like this benevolent foster home for stories that are too long for traditional magazines and too short to be books. And Sayre Darby and Jonah Ogles say, come here, little story. We're going to make you a star. And damn it, they do it. You know this. Go to magazine.atavist.com and consider getting a subscription for yourself or a friend. It's some of the best money you'll spend. It really is. The work that they do to package these stories is next level. It's wonderful stuff. You're not going to have ads bombarding you as you're reading these stories. You truly get to immerse yourself in the stories. And no, I don't get kickbacks for subscriptions, so how dare you? How dare you, Donna? Before we get to Mike, we're going to hear from Jonah Ogles, the lead editor of this piece. So why don't we do that, CNFers? Okay, let's do that, okay? Nice. But before we talk to him, I came across this interview with Dave Remnick and Paul Thomas Anderson, and there was something that Remnick said in asking him that I kind of disagree with, and about this notion of genius and talent. And I wanted to get your impression of working with people that are really high performers in this line of work. And he had said, in asking Paul Thomas Anderson about writing, he's like, you have the self to do it, and nothing else is required other than, well, genius or talent. And he goes on, and I was just like, well, to be a genius is, obviously very limiting. And then I guess there has to be some sort of a kernel of talent, but I feel like that's really setting the bar almost too high and almost squashing a lot of people. Would be like, I don't feel that talented. I'm certainly not a genius. I think it discounts the work that sometimes, if you just have enough rigor, you can get really damn good at this line of work. So I wonder, maybe what your impressions are of that.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think talent is really helpful. I often told young aspiring writers or staffers when I was at Outside that they either needed to have so much talent that they could coast on that, or they had to be willing to work harder than anybody. Because as an editor, I'm willing to put up with missed deadlines and cranky writers if the writing is really good. So the talent can get you a long ways, but I think you're right. You've got to be willing to work for it. And George Saunders and his sort of instructional, his last book was like an instructional book about becoming a fiction writer. And he said that the writers that he has taught who have gone on to have the most publishing success have not been the ones who are most talented. They're the ones who are most willing to revise and revise and revise. And I think that is the greatest indicator of success in writing in general. If you're willing to show up and put in the work and not succumb to the thoughts of, hey, maybe I'm not talented enough for this, or hey, I don't really want to work on this right now. If you can push through that, I think you can actually, that's what it takes to be successful, is just doing it over and over and over again and sort of showing up every day.
Well, and to that point too, and to piggyback kind of on a sport metaphor, like there are innumerable, there is a graveyard of talented athletes who were the fastest and the most gifted, but they weren't very good, even though they had some of these intangible things that are objectively high talent. But that you see so many players who didn't have the greatest 40-yard dash time, but they're some of the greatest wide receivers of all time. So it's like, it's this thing where, yeah, you do need some talent, but the really hard work really does trump talent, because we can rattle off any number of very talented people who didn't amount to much.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you could look at like, and I don't know if this is going in the podcast or not. I may be hanging my neck out here, but you look at somebody like John Krakauer, and granted, like Krakauer, I actually do think has talent, but that dude works so hard. He is relentless in his reporting, and he does not stop, and he keeps writing. And you look at the career he's had, and I think you attribute that to hard work. Certainly, talent is going to help, as it'll help anybody. But I also think talent can be sort of cultivated. If you're willing to look at a sentence and try to make it better and better, I do think that long term, your sentences are going to get better. I think, like a year or two ago, I read the journal that John Steinbeck kept while he was writing East of Eden. And, that book was more or less published the way he wrote it. There wasn't really a revision process. And part of that may have been sort of the state of publishing in that day and the stature that he had at the time that book was published. But certainly, I suspect that his sentences when he wrote East of Eden were better than the first sentences he put down when he wrote some earlier book. Yeah. I think the harder you work, the better you will get at whatever it is. Look at, it can be anything. It could be cooking, it could be parenting, it could be, talking to your spouse. If you work at these things, it gets easier over time to get things to go the way you want them to go.
Yeah, and bringing up Saunders and revision, and this is just coincidence. I was just cleaning out some email, and I came across, I subscribed to James Clear's newsletter, which is kind of cool, his 321 newsletter, and he in his headline had something to do with the difference between good and great. And he wrote, the difference between good and great is often an extra round of revision. The person who looks things over a second time, or in my case, like third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 10th time, will appear smarter or more talented, but actually is just polishing things a bit more. Take the time to get it right, revise it one extra time. And that's exactly what you're talking about with Saunders and Krakauer and everyone else who is really good at this, is that extra bit of rigor.
Yeah, I remember when I was starting to edit features, and I felt buried in deadlines, and I was sort of trying to move as quickly as I could. One of the editors at Outside, who I'd sent a story to them for top edit, and they just brought it back to me printed out, and they said, just read it one more time, like not today, but just let it sit here on your desk, and tomorrow read it one more time, and then send it back to me, because that extra effort is always worth it. It always is.
Nice. And speaking of, a great effort and a great story, Mike Damiano, wrote a great story about the Alfonso Rapu, this a charismatic school teacher who essentially, leads a nonviolent revolution on Easter Island and, changes the course of their history in the mid to late 20th century. So, yeah, maybe you just talk a little bit about this piece and, what lit you up about it.
Yeah, well, so Mike sent us this pitch in May 2019. So he'd been reporting it years and years before that. So he'd really done the work on the front end. And this was one of those stories that it showed up in our inboxes, and, Sayward said to me, I think this is good. And I said, yep, me too. And, the pitch was so clear already in the story that Mike wanted to tell. And, I think it wasn't just, we're attracted to good writing and writers who have a really clear sense of the story they want to tell. But, in this particular case, it's also this really interesting piece of history that has, essentially been overlooked at least in the U.S. Maybe that's not the case in Chile. I don't know, but it's really fascinating to hear this sort of very self-contained story about nonviolence and about, the struggle for equal rights. And it sort of spoke to, that 2019, as we got this pitch, was obviously a year of, some upheaval. And, so it felt like a story that, had resonated a little bit with modern current events as well.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful story. And I am, when I was talking to Mike about it, the idea of it had started more or less like a big sweeping book project, and then he was able to really distill, this story to a sliver of what he knows about it. But it is still animated by such great action and personality. So, what was the challenge on your end to really drive that story home and to structure this thing in such a way where we're driven by the charismatic people at the center of it, but also it's imbued with a great amount of history that goes back, centuries.
Yeah. Yeah. And in editing this, I really felt like I was editing a book, because I wasn't doing a ton of line editing because I didn't need to. Mike's just that good a writer. And I didn't do we didn't have a ton of conversations about structural changes or anything like that. Mostly what I was doing, we were talking about just the larger shape of it, bringing Alfonso more to the forefront in certain places, identifying spots where I thought maybe we drifted a little bit from that main arc and the tension that it contained. So it really, I think the first memo I sent him was probably very short and was basically amounted to me saying, more Alfonso here, a little bit less of this here. Mm-hmm. How does that sound to you, Mike? And, I think we had like one conversation after that memo, and then he knows the story so deeply that conversation was all it really took, and after that, the story was more or less in the shape that it's in now. We did some trimming and tightening the way we always do with stories, but really it was, the story was there, and we just helped cut away some of those extraneous bits that kept us away from that momentum you described.
And I really like how the piece comes to its coda at the end, where Mike is, he's in the story at the very end, where there's some very complicated, feelings and allegations against Alfonso too that are very unsettling to the characters at the heart of it, and certainly to Mike too. And we kind of spoke about that as well. And it was a great, I think, a great strategy of him to come in at the end as kind of an epilogue to the story with him there. But it also it brought in a complicated layer of nuance to the story of the hero at the center of it isn't quite as noble as we had hoped.
Yeah, and that's what stories of this length allow us to do. I feel like, if this were a 3,000 word piece in a traditional print magazine, I mean, I don't know how you'd be able. Well, I don't know how you'd be able to tell it in 3,000 words, honestly. But maybe I've just been spoiled by being at the Atavist this long. But that sort of nuance can end up on the cutting room floor when you're really trying to get it down to just the bare minimum. And I like that. I mean, obviously, I don't like what happened to Alfonso or those around him as the years went on. But I like that that Mike both had the perseverance to pursue that, and keep reporting the story, and that we have the space to allow him to talk about, how it made him feel, how Alfonso responded, how those around him, thought of him after the allegations came out or after Mike discovered them. So it's a good way to end the story solely in terms of the way it sort of complicates the picture, because that's true of anything. Stories are always complicated, and that's why I love reading books and working at this length, because we can get into that.
Nice. Well, Jonah, always a pleasure to get your insights on what it's like to, edit pieces of this nature. And it was kind of cool to dig into some of the other things that are sort of tangentially related to the work at hand and the work that we do at large. So it's always good to have these conversations. And so thanks for the time. And we're going to kick it over to Mike now.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right, as we tee up Mike Damiano from the Blue Tees, I want to remind you to keep the conversation going at Twitter at CNFPod or at Creative Nonfiction Podcast on Instagram. You can support the show by becoming a paid member at patreon.com/CNFPod. I know you only have a few discretionary dollars to throw at various subscriptions, whether it be literary magazines or or Atavist. There's just so many things where it's like you want to support. It's like, I want to do it. I want to support that, but it's just I only have so many dollars. I only have maybe a couple $100 a year, if that, to ferry towards these subscriptions. And I understand it's hard, but if you can, it's something I deeply appreciate. As I say from time to time, the show's free, but it sure as hell ain't cheap. Members get transcripts, chances to ask questions of future guests, of which I give credit to you for that. I'm working on special exclusive podcasts and such for those Patreon members in that community. So think about it. Listen, no hard feelings if you don't want to. I understand. But consider free ways to support the show. Hey, you can leave a kind review or a rating. Written reviews are the best. And for our little podcast that could, we've got a hell of a lot of written reviews for how relatively small the audience is. It's amazing. But can always use more. Always use more. So go to Apple Podcasts or even give it a rating on Spotify. Link up to the show on social media channels and tag the show, and then I'll be sure to give you digital fist bumps and retweets and maybe even a shout out at the top of the show. Why not? We're all in this fucking shithole together, am I right? Show notes and my up to 11 monthly newsletter can be found at brendanomero.com. Hey, once a month, no spam. As far as I can tell, you can't beat it. It's kind of like the Atavist, am I right? All right, one other little thing. Support for the Creative Nonfiction Podcast is also brought to you by West Virginia Wesleyan Colleges. I can never say Wesleyan. It always just, it never flows out of my mouth. You know what I'm saying? West Virginia Wesleyan Colleges, low residency MFA in creative writing. Now, in its 10th year, this affordable program boasts a low student-to-faculty ratio and a strong sense of community. We dig that, man. Recent CNF faculty include Random Billings Noble, Jeremy Jones, and CNF Pod alum Sarah Einstein. There are also fiction and poetry tracks with recent faculty including Ashley Bryant Phillips and Jacinta Townsend, as well as Diane Gilliam and Savannah Sipple. No matter your discipline, man, if you're looking to up your craft or maybe even learn a new one, consider West Virginia Wesleyan, right in the heart of Appalachia. Visit mfa.wvwc.edu for more information and dates of enrollment. So we had just spoken with Jonah, of course. Always great to speak with Jonah about the piece at hand. Also nice to dig into that quote from David Remnick, editor of the New Yorker. This place that I would just die to have something in. Well, you're either a genius or you're super talented. And if you're not either, you're kind of fucked. Maybe that was an unfair reading of it, but I hate when people attribute genius or supreme talent as to why a piece of art is electric. I think it discounts the work, undercuts the work, and also makes the late bloomers among us, the less quote-unquote gifted among us, feel pretty lousy. If I ever have Remnick on the show, which it's always been a goal of mine, I would want to, and I hope I have the spine to unpack that a little more. That really boils my potato. Anywho, this is about Mike Damiano, isn't it? So in this part of the show, we get into the origins of how Mike arrived at this story. But partway through, I cut in as an aside because we pivot to update some information on his main character, Alfonso Rapu. Then we go back to the original through line of the conversation. I cut in one more time to add another piece to the conversation, so it's a bit more fractured than you're used to, but I think it's a good ride, if you ask me. For you reporter types out there, some great stuff about having to ask probing, awkward, even bridge-burning questions of your key figures. So I feel I've wasted your time enough already, so why don't we just get into the real meat of this conversation. Here's my conversation with the one, the only, the final episode of 2021, the final interview with Mike Damiano.
This project, I guess, maybe like a lot of Atavist stories, has been a while in the making. I think I started working on it more than a decade ago. Definitely more than a decade ago. It started, of all places, while I was studying abroad in Valparaiso, Chile. And I had a history professor then who was just frustrated that the colonial history of Easter Island under Chile just hadn't been integrated fully into kind of public school history curriculum in the country. And she just thought it deserved more attention. And that got me just researching the island. I went to the island and talked to some people. And basically, what the story of Easter Island is that in the late 19th century, the Chilean government annexed the island, had this whole fantasy that they were going to turn it into this, paradise in the Pacific, this fantasy colony in the Pacific, and it just didn't come to pass. They didn't understand the challenges of surviving on the island, and the first settler families there fled or died, and they got buyer's remorse, and they pawned off the whole island to a for-profit entity that came to be known as the Easter Island Exploitation Company. That was the official name. And they walled the Rapa Nui people, the native people of the island, into 1 corner of the island. And then the Rapa Nui people were stuck there for 70 years until this story begins, or until this story ends, really. By the time that the protagonist of my story is a teenager, the company is gone, and the Navy has replaced it as the authority on the island. So the people have gone from living essentially as serfs in this kind of feudal regime to now just living under authoritarian naval regime, where this naval governor sent from Chile ruled unaccountably and visited various horrors and atrocities on the Rapa Nui people. Our protagonist, Alfonso Rapu, was able to put an end to that regime. This project started actually as a more sprawling book project, where I was planning on telling various stories. In the piece, I refer to these 3 movements or moments or episodes of resistance against foreign authority, foreign rule. And in this book project, I had planned to tell each of those stories and also kind of integrate those with or tell them in concert with the ancient history. It was this kind of a sprawling book that probably didn't hold together as a single work conceptually. And it just didn't come to fruition for those reasons. But there's always this story of Alfonso Rapu's revolution in 1964 that just felt like it needed to be told. And especially that felt like I had something really new and different in my reporting to say about it. So I'd been looking for years for a place for this story to land. And the Atavist is just really obviously the right place for it.
Now, with the telling of the story and the fact that it kind of was the sprawling book project, would you say that the great lesson maybe you learned just in terms of research, reporting, and writing is that maybe sometimes the best way to approach a story of this nature is to maybe see if it can stand alone as a longer magazine piece, and if it merits that, like that's kind of like the audition for it to see if there's a book in it.
I think that's a good idea. Certainly, that's the more natural progression of stories, right? I think that there's sometimes. I think a lot of not a lot. It sometimes occurs that a great magazine story winds up, getting sold as a book and is less good as a book just because it can't really sustain that length.
Yeah,
this one was different because it was really, I didn't condense the entire book project into 20,000 words here or whatever it is. I really extracted basically a chapter from that book project, told it at the length that I think made sense for that one story, and then just, brought in enough of the other chapters, what would have been the other chapters, to give the reader the background information they need.
Now, what would you say separates an Alfonso Rapu from a lot of other revolutionaries that we might have read about in the 20th century?
Yeah, I think great question, because to me, Alfonso Rapu and his followers are, the protagonists of a great civil rights movement of the 20th century, which has gone relatively unnoticed. Not surprising. It's a small number of people on a small island lost in the Pacific, but it is one of, in my view, it is a great civil rights movement. He had similar goals to the goals of other civil rights leaders. He was demanding full civil rights, full citizenship, the same protections by the state that were afforded to Chileans on the mainland and that were denied to the Rapa Nui people who were living under this special and brutal regime. I don't really want to make certain comparisons, but he had looked. He definitely viewed himself in a context of being one leader in the world who was demanding rights for his people.
Now, what kind of makes him unique as well is that he became educated in Chile. Well, he went to university there and studied to be a teacher, and he could have maybe stayed there or gone to the United States but he chose to come back to Easter Island and try to help the people there. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about him as the school teacher who set about this this revolution of sorts.
Yeah, there were definitely easier lives available to him, more comfortable lives, less dangerous lives available to him, and I think a couple of things were going on. I mean, he was thinking of his family. He while he was in Chile for about a decade studying in the Chilean school system, he visited twice, and he saw the first time he saw with fresh eyes the state that his people were living in, the state that he had been living in, and the second time he saw that his brother had been brutalized by the Navy regime. And he was haunted. I don't think that, the ostensibly more comfortable life available to him elsewhere would have actually been more comfortable for him in the state that he was in, the state of anxiety and worry that he was in. So he did what he felt he had to do. The interesting thing is that, like so many people who find themselves at the center of momentous events, he didn't mean to. I mean, he did find himself in those circumstances. When he returned to Easter Island, he didn't have a plan. He didn't have a roadmap for how he was going to overthrow a naval regime. It would have been absurd to think that he could even do that. He just went back to help. He knew what the problems were, but he didn't know what the plan was. He didn't have a plan, and that only took shape and, frankly, was improvised by him and his allies over the year that he was there, leading to the revolution.
Yeah, he was going to use education as the main weapon to make sure that everyone was literate in Spanish, so that nothing nefarious was going on too. Like that was going to be, the major weapon of this.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's, he used what he had at his disposal. He was, not a military man. He was a teacher. That gave him the ability to educate and to organize and to draw the community in around him in a way that gave him influence to petition for change, to demand changes on the island. And another important feature for Alfonso was his commitment to nonviolence. He always, this ties into how he viewed himself in the context of civil rights movements. He viewed nonviolence as essential to the cause and to his own mission, which not everyone agreed with. I mean, his people had been brutalized. Violence had been committed against them. It wasn't just immoral. It wasn't just out of the sense of morality. He pragmatically believed that nonviolence was the answer and was the path forward.
Now, how did you come to know and meet Alfonso?
So I was on the island in 2012, beginning research for the book project. And I was researching a number of episodes, including, current or 21st century struggles, conflicts between the Rapa Nui people and the Chilean state. So, Alfonso's story was one of the stories, one of the most important stories I was researching. I guess I don't remember, exactly who made the connection, but, in Hangaroa, in the village on Easter Island, it's really a matter of showing up at people's houses, knowing someone who knows someone. So we met in his living room and started having these very long conversations about his life, about the movement of 1964. And eventually he got tired of the recorded interviews. So he had me out to his pineapple farm. He's a pineapple farmer now. We worked and we talked. And that's how he told me the story.
I love how the piece essentially ends with that little anecdote you just shared. That's when you come into the story at the very end, where you kind of, this is kind of how we went about having these conversations. So, what was the structural choice for you to kind of end the piece or start to bring the airliner down with that scene?
So I think the only reason, there may be two reasons. I think the piece, ending, the main narrative of the piece ending as it does in 1965 kind of begs the question of, well, what happened to these people, especially Alfonso? So I guess a natural way to answer that question is just to, come see for yourself, right? Come show people with first person narrative in that way. But the other reason is because of the absolutely gutting revelation, discovery that Alfonso is a complicated and deeply flawed man who became, at least in part, so much of what he loathed, and became a violent man who hit his wife. And I didn't learn that until my last trip to the island in 2020. And that, to me, was a reality, a complicating reality that had to be divulged and engaged with. And it just seemed that the most straightforward way to present it was just to no mediation of third person narration, just go straight to the source.
Hey, we're going to break away from the main spine of the conversation for just a moment because there was late breaking news, so to speak, regarding Alfonso and Carmen, his wife, in this story. A day after Mike and I had spoken on the mics for this podcast, he finally was able to reach Alfonso for comment about the allegations that he physically abused Carmen. So here's the latest from Mike.
I finally got in touch with Alfonso, which took a little bit of effort, and I had to bring this to him, give him the opportunity to respond to the allegation that he had abused his wife Carmen, that he had hit his wife Carmen over the course of their marriage. And he denied it outright, which I don't know if I should have been surprised or not. But he said, no, that is not true. We had one big argument once. And he said, people say things about me. People once accused me of being a communist because they opposed me politically. Apparently, they're now saying this about me as well. So that's his response. And three siblings of my sourcing on this is that three siblings of Carmen's independently told me that Alfonso had abused Carmen over a period of decades, and that was the cause of their separation, which occurred about a decade ago. And of course, as I write in the story, I brought this to Carmen directly, and it was an awkward, difficult conversation. She clearly did not want to talk about it. I mean, this is not an allegation that she was looking to level. But when I, confronted her with it in really straightforward language, she just demurred. It's important to acknowledge that she did not say, yes, he did this to me. She demurred and said there's some things that are mine that I'm not going to talk about. And so she declined to deny it. I took that as confirmation, but one does not have to interpret it the same way I did. So that's what we're left with. The three siblings affirmatively leveling this accusation, Carmen not knocking it down, and Alfonso denying it outright.
Yeah, the early in the piece, when you're talking about his family and everything, and his father, was would be Alfonso's mother, and it was something that was very scary for all the children, especially him. And then, that revelation at the end that he can't outrun that part of his history. Yeah. All this despite the fact that he was so committed to nonviolence that he still couldn't outrun the violence that is essentially baked into the DNA sometimes.
It used to be a philosophical question about individual responsibility, or kind of the consequences of systemic oppression and the trauma that results. A piece of journalism can't really settle that philosophical question about what to make of it. But I think about it, and we know that domestic violence was endemic in Hangaroa in the colonial and naval era, and we know that domestic violence has become endemic in many colonized communities. it seems to be one of the consequences, one of the symptoms of colonialism, for reasons that are beyond my ability to explain. So I do think of it in that context. This was a trauma in a context that he couldn't escape, despite, as you say, the nonviolent inclinations and kind of the temperamental gentleness that he also does have.
Now, with respect to how a journalist might approach something of this nature, or a historian, have you toggled the difference between those two, given some of your background as a journalist and someone who studied history?
Yeah, I think that maybe it's a cop out, but like I get to just say, this is a work of journalism, not a work of history. It's not a cop out; it's just reality. I mean, that's right. These are different. These are different disciplines that bring different things to a reader and to the public. They seek out and impart different kinds of knowledge. For example, a work of history would have to deal more fully with the broader political context of what was going on at this time. I spend very little time in the piece dealing with the both domestic and international pressure that the administration of President Frey was under, that made him and his administration more inclined to give Alfonso what he wanted. My piece does not attempt to make an assessment or an argument about the relative importance of the factors on the island, which is Alfonso's movement, and the broader political context. That this work of journalism takes place at a more human level of this is what these people did and lived. So I think that's kind of the difference. And I think a work of journalism like this that relies on a lot of firsthand accounts can provide a lot of the grist for future historical work.
When it came to the writing of the piece, so what did you identify as maybe a fundamental challenge of finding the right structure for it?
One thing I wondered about and just had to make a decision about was, do you tell this as kind of a authoritative, almost omniscient, third person narrator voice, or do you do it in a more traditional, more conventional journalistic mode of quoting people, Alfonso recalls today, stuff like that. It really came down to what I was able to say in this kind of, and I chose the former method, right? It's just a narrative. There's no quoting Alfonso telling me something in 2012 about something that happened in 1964. It's all extensively footnoted for fact checking from these interviews, but I chose to just write it as a narrative. And what that means is that I excluded some things that just couldn't be absolutely nailed down. Whereas if I had been, using the more conventional mode of presenting people's differing views of what occurred, well, then I could just do that. I could present, to the extent that some matter of fact was disputed, I could just give two people's views and move on. Because of choosing to write it in the mode that I did, stuff that was more disputed just got left out. But I had enough that was concrete enough that I could write the narrative I did in the mode I did, and I just kind of the almost novelistic third person narrative voice. And one thing that enabled me to do that was coming upon this massive trove of contemporaneous documents in early 2020 that corroborated and expanded on and a lot of the material I had and continued to get in interviews.
Well, I like that. There's always so much under the hood of a piece of this nature. It's kind of like, I think John McPhee talks about this, or people who revere McPhee, myself included, who love to talk about structure, where he might have said, or someone might have said, that it's on us as the writers. We have all the scaffolding there, and that helps us build the structure. But in the end, we got to pull all that stuff down so someone can enjoy the structure, the building, without having known all the grit that went into the formulation of the structure itself.
Yeah, and in terms of structure, the structure is a little bit funny in this piece because there's so much history to tell. right? I mean, we tell the colonial history, or, the post Chile history, or the post Chilean annexation history from 1888 forward, and then we also tell a summary of the island's ancient history going back 1,000 years. And so structurally, that was a little funny to figure out how to work that in. Hopefully it worked. I mean, I think one thing I'm happy is that we didn't like try to do it chronologically. We didn't put it all in one place. It kind of peppered in where it seems relevant to the main narrative. So we wind up kind of going back in time three or four times during the piece.
Yeah, I really like that where you put in sort of the ancient history and the population of the island from the Polynesians who found the island, Tahitians, or wherever the main pioneers of the island were, and then how all the clans and tribes had different portions of the island, and of course it kind of devolves into a lot of feuds that were likely about resources and everything. And I really love that section where you also talk about the famous statues. So it gave the story to me like an extra level of elevation, like where you choose to do it, which is pretty much right in the middle.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, yeah. So there were kind of two things driving that. One was you just can't ask somebody to read 15 or 20,000 words about Easter Island and not tell them about the statues and not tell them about the ancient history. That's just one matter. But the second matter, convenient thing from a storytelling perspective is that part of Alfonso's strategy was to bring that history, bring that proud heritage to the fore in 1964 while he's organizing, as a reference point for the community to say, we are the inheritors of this society, and we're still here, and this is still our island. Inculcating a sense of identity and pride in his followers before they did this difficult thing. So that became a very natural place to then tell what that story actually was.
Now, for you, where is the juice? Would you say it's in the reporting or the writing of a piece?
Yeah, I don't know which one. I think definitely earlier in my career, I would definitely have said the reporting and researching. I think because it took me longer to figure out how to write in a way that felt somewhat competent. And now I feel like I have a little bit better handle on writing. I mean, not really trying to overstate anything there, but maybe it feels a little more balanced to me. Certainly, a decade ago when I was first researching this story, the reporting and the research was the juice. And I really felt like I was, making progress, getting somewhere. And then the writing felt pretty difficult and like a chore. So I think that's shifted just as I've written a lot more for a while to now where the writing itself feels better than it used to.
Now, how have you gotten comfortable over the years having to have those uncomfortable conversations? And specifically what really triggers this for me is when you have to, when you, towards the end of the piece, when you're talking to Carmen about Rapu, hitting her.
Yeah.
And that's a really tense, hard conversation to have, especially as an outsider. So I wonder how you've danced with that.
Yeah, it's awful. I mean, you just have to go straight at it. I mean, it's never comfortable. It's, at least not for me. It's never comfortable. It's never comfortable prying and doing what is really an indecent thing, which is walking into someone's home, walking into a stranger's home who's just invited you in and saying, "Nice to meet you. I'd like you to tell me about some of the most painful memories in your life, and I'm going to record it." Yeah. That's just an outrageous thing to do. And I kind of never forget that, or that never ceases to be a pretty salient part of the experience for me. But I don't know, it's the job. And weirdly, people, are pretty gracious about it. Carmen was quite gracious about it. And we'll go with you usually. She didn't kick me out of the house.
Yeah, and amazingly, how she goes on to explain to you this the story. She's like, "There's a sad story of water and survival here," and she goes on. And maybe you can expand on what she told you, which is just so heavy with wisdom, and the fact that she explained it to you in such a way, in that particular way, I just found incredibly moving.
Yeah. I kind of deliberately just kind of put that there and didn't try to say much about it or explain it. And I don't think I have any, special authority to explain what she meant any more than a reader does. But, for me, it makes me think about the stakes of what happened there and the starkness of the change. And what she's saying is that, this was really about survival on a really deep level. Not it was about biological survival, and it was about kind of existential survival, and that the people wouldn't have survived in either sense without escaping from the regime they were living under and the conditions they were living in. I think another part of it is just that she knows. I think she intuits that, someone like me coming to this story, almost any reader coming to the story, just truly cannot grapple with what the life was like that she and Alfonso and other Rapa Nui people were living in the 40s, 50s, and 60s before the movement. I mean, when in your life have you ever not had access to water or had to walk 4 miles to get it? I just have no reference for that. And I think she knows that, and I think she wants to impress that on me. And that's why she says, people always come and ask, about the political history and like the kind of the political events or the socio-political events, because maybe that's what we're prone to do in our context. And she's like, kind of remember, we didn't even have water. That's the level that our struggle was at.
Oh yeah, and then throw on top of that in order for survival, you make certain concessions, maybe ethically or morally, for yourself to survive, and that might be hitching your caboose to, I don't know, people who might be abusive to reach a different level, a different plane of survival, just to stay alive. It's that's what all rolled into that, at least for me when I was reading it.
Yeah, I think that's another legitimate reading, and and also that makes me think about the men of the old guard, or the families of the old guards, not just the political leaders of the old guards, the families that follow them. I mean, they hitched themselves to the Navy. It was the way they knew to get ahead, and they came to believe that supporting the Navy, aligning themselves with the Navy was, not only useful but right, as people tend to do. They tend to convince themselves that what they need to do is also the right thing to do, and that's why Alfonso forgave those men and those families. He was sympathetic to the situation they were in and the limited options they had available to them.
Now, earlier when I stepped in for an aside to let Mike expand on Alfonso's situation, we kept talking for a few more minutes about how complicated it can be to have this question, what we call the bridge burning question, in your back pocket when dealing with the principal figure of your story. As the image says, and you ask the question, you may never get to go to that well ever again. And that gets to a point we were talking about earlier, where I asked you about how challenging it is to even ask Carmen about it, and here you have to, just responsibly doing your reporting and diligence, going to Alfonso for response. And here is someone who has done great things and is, by most accounts, an incredibly admirable person. And granted, these are allegations, but it's still something that, you have to like awkwardly bring to him, and it's uncomfortable. And I imagine this was probably one of the more uncomfortable phone calls you had to make over the course of the reporting for this piece.
Yeah, that's true. And the reason I did it late is because I didn't want to do it. I tried to do this in person when I was on the island in 2020, just before the pandemic began. And Alfonso was just very unavailable. It was bad luck. Alfonso was just very unavailable during the 2 weeks I was there. We had one very long interview, but then I was not able to have a follow-up interviews with him during that reporting trip. Frankly, that may be part of the reason that I discovered this. There was a lot of time that I had been planning on spending with Alfonso that I wound up spending going around the village talking to whoever I could. And one of those people was Carmen's brother, who was the first person who told me about this. In any case, I had wanted to do this in person. It was not possible because I just was never able to get FaceTime with him again. And then I just, yes, from a not professional standpoint, from a personal standpoint, just really didn't want to have this call. I am way too close to this subject. This is a person who I met when I was very young, not very young, but I was, in my mid-20s. And I just have, before I learned this, I had a very uncomplicated respect and admiration for Alfonso. Frankly, discovering this allegation against him, which I believed and continue to believe, was personally devastating. And I have very complicated feelings about him at this point. It was a strange call when I talked to him about this. I mean, I brought the allegation to him. He denied it. And then we were on the phone for 45 more minutes talking about the island and politics and the pandemic in a way that was very reminiscent of the long conversations we used to have on the island on his farm. So yeah, that's the kind of collision of personal feelings and professional obligations.
Yeah, it's got to be tricky too. Like, here's probably something that you've wanted to maybe talk to him or bring up earlier, but it's like if it's a kind of a bridge burning question in a lot of ways, or it could be. The fact that you just said that you were able to speak for 45 minutes afterwards means like, all right, like there's a relationship there that's not easily fractured. But that said, it's like, here's this thing that's in the back of your pocket that you really have to ask about. But if you ask it too early in your reporting, you might totally lose him as a source for the story that you wanted to tell.
So that is absolutely, I spoke to the personal reasons that I delayed this conversation, but what you just said was absolutely a practical calculation that was made, because I had the expectation that you were just alluding to, that this would be a completely bridge burning conversation. That when I brought this up, that would be the end of my relationship with Alfonso and of his participation in the story. And this obviously his participation in the story was quite important. So yes, there were practical considerations also that led me to do this late. And yeah, I did not predict how this conversation would go in any way correctly. I somehow imagined some kind of more introspective conversation with him about this. That was not a reasonable expectation. He just denied it. And I expected it to be a relationship and conversation ender, and that was not the case either. He denied it and, moved on. So yes, that's how it shook out.
Well, very nice. Well, Mike, it was a wonderful piece, and it's I really have to just commend you on a job well done about how you're able to sustain the story and the tension and the narrative drive behind it. So it's just a wonderful piece to read. So thank you so much for the work.
Oh, thanks a lot, Brendan, for your interest and for the conversation.
And where can people find you online and get more familiar with your work if they're not familiar with it already?
Most of my clips are at bostonmagazine.com, where I've been writing features for the past 6 years.
Very nice. Excellent. And any social media to speak of?
Oh, I have a very inactive Twitter account where I retweet links to some of my stories. It's at MJ Damiano.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for the conversation as well, Mike. And like I said, amazing piece.
Oh, thanks a lot.
Well, that was great. Bit of a challenge, if I'm being honest, to stitch all of that together in the end, but we're professionals here at CNF Pod HQ. Well, thanks to Jonah, Sayward, Mike Damiano, and West Virginia Wesleyan's MFA in creative writing for the time and the support this year. I can't believe this is the final podcast of 2021. It's bonkers. I'm not going to do a year in review, but we had a nice year. Starting with episode 235 with Mason Gravely. Jesus, what the... Way to end the year, B.O. Way to end on a high note. We finished the year with a wonderful partnership with the Atavist. Made some extra pods. I think it was about 60 interviews this year, including the audio magazine. Well, it does not include the audio magazine. The audio magazine was something else. Anyway, listen. I don't have much to say other than thank you. Thank you for being along for this CNF and ride through the good and the bad, my meanderings, my missteps, my incessant complaining and bitching, my stumbles, my stammering. But before I get too emotional, I'll say this. Happy New Year, CNFers. And if you can do, interview. See you next year.